Walk down the Strand in Galveston, Texas today, and you'll find a weathered tourist district. Restored Victorian facades hide souvenir shops, local art galleries, and cafes. Tourists sweat in the heavy Gulf Coast heat, stopping to snap photos of the archaic architecture. It's quiet, picturesque, but in the final decade of the 19th century, quaint was the last word anyone used for this island. In 1899, this exact stretch of pavement was the Wall Street of the South. When we look at how rich cities turn into fading relics, if you want to dig into the ignored warnings and forgotten ledgers of history's worst municipal failures, hit subscribe. To grasp what they lost, look at the money operating on this small patch of sand. At the close of the Gilded Age, Galveston had the highest per capita wealth in Texas. It was a financial machine. Sitting right on the Gulf of Mexico, it held a monopoly on regional shipping. Houston, 50 miles inland, was just a muddy bayou town in comparison. Galveston was the gateway. The port handled hundreds of millions of dollars in exports annually. Over 1 million bales of cotton moved through the wharves each year, 70% of the entire U.S. crop. The harbor was packed with wooden masts and steamship smokestacks from Liverpool and Bremen, loading up on Texas lumber and Midwestern grain. 32 international consulates operated within city limits. Galveston was the first city in Texas to install gas lights. They had electricity first. They used telephones first. All that cash transformed the island. The commercial district was a dense grid of banks and trading houses built from imported Belgian brick and heavy cast iron. Further inland, along Broadway, the city's elite built Millionaire's Row. Forget modest coastal cottages. These were colossal Victorian mansions funded by railroad and shipping money. Look at the archival photos of the Gresham Mansion, now called the Bishop's Palace. It was a fortress of steel, Texas granite, and red sandstone, with stained glass windows imported from Europe. These structures were designed to project total permanence. They signaled to investors in New York and London that Galveston was an immovable fixture of the American economy. It was a massive illusion. Galveston isn't built on bedrock. It's a barrier island. Geologically, a barrier island is a temporary feature, a shifting sandbar designed to absorb the kinetic energy of the ocean and protect the mainland from heavy surf. It's meant to move. It's supposed to change shape. At its highest natural point, the island sat just 8.7 feet above the Gulf's low tide line. The commercial wharves, working-class wards, and rail yards sat at 4 or 5 feet of elevation. The massive granite blocks and heavy iron facades were resting on compacted sand and crushed oyster shells. There was no natural high ground, no coastal ridges. The entire opulent city balanced on a flat, porous shelf skimming just above sea level. This geographic danger wasn't a secret. City leaders knew the island was vulnerable to the Gulf. In the 1870s and 1880s, coastal storms had grazed Texas, pushing ocean water into Galveston's lower streets and causing millions in damage. After a severe storm in 1886, engineers and military figures pushed for a massive protective seawall along the Gulf-facing beach. They drafted concepts and submitted proposals to the city council. They argued a reinforced concrete barricade was the only way to break the force of the open ocean and secure the city's future. The city council killed the legislation. The rejection of the seawall came down to short-term balance sheets. Building a multi-mile concrete barricade required massive municipal bonds. That meant raising property taxes on the tycoons and merchants who controlled the local government. They weren't about to reduce their own profit margins to fund a hypothetical defense project. Local real estate developers and tourism boards also argued a seawall was a commercial liability. Galveston was a summer destination for the wealthy elite of the American South. A seawall would block the ocean breeze and obstruct Gulf views from the Broadway mansions. It would deter the rich tourists coming to bathe in the warm waters. Instead of addressing the danger, the city elites got arrogant. When a hurricane wiped the neighboring town of Indianola off the map in 1886, Galveston's leaders didn't take it as a warning. They pointed to their own survival as proof of their superiority. Railroad barons and cotton brokers convinced themselves a direct strike from a hurricane was statistically impossible. They claimed the ocean floor off their coast was too shallow to allow a significant storm surge. The theory had zero scientific merit. It existed solely to protect property values and maintain investor confidence. By choosing ocean views and low taxes over a seawall, the local government turned a geographic vulnerability into a ticking clock. Nearly 40,000 residents were living completely exposed to the open water. By 1900, the citizens of Galveston placed their faith in the heavy masonry of their banks. They acted as if commercial supremacy granted them immunity from the weather. They kept pouring millions into grand architecture instead of a seawall, leaving the flat sandbar unprotected. But the Gulf of Mexico doesn't care about per capita wealth or municipal pride. That fragile barrier between their fortune and the ocean was about to break. By August 1900, the population of this barrier island hit 40,000. Electric streetcars shuttled financiers from towering downtown banks to the sweeping verandas of their coastal estates. Down at the wharves, thousands of longshoremen worked around the clock. They loaded millions of pounds of cotton, grain, and lumber into massive steamships bound for Europe. The city was an engine built for one purpose: extract wealth from the Texas mainland and push it out to the world. But while Galveston's elites chased shipping contracts, a different machine was failing in Washington, D.C. The newly established United States Weather Bureau was about to blind them. In 1900, meteorology wasn't just science, it was commercial intelligence. If you controlled the forecast, you controlled the economy. Shipping magnates and agricultural brokers relied on the Bureau's telegraph network to run their empires. A storm warning meant ships dropped anchor, cargo sat, profits evaporated. Because a bad forecast cost millions, the central office in Washington faced immense pressure to avoid false alarms. Panic was expensive. That financial reality bred an obsession with control. Willis Moore, chief of the U.S. Weather Bureau, demanded absolute authority over American weather data. He wanted a centralized system. Raw numbers would flow into Washington, his top scientists would analyze them, and only then would forecasts trickle down to local field offices. But Moore's network had a fatal blind spot. 90 miles south of Florida, the world's best hurricane experts operated entirely outside his jurisdiction. For decades, the Jesuit priests at the Balin Observatory in Havana had tracked Caribbean cyclones. Led by Father Lorenzo Ganguait, these Cuban meteorologists actually understood how these storms formed and traveled. They watched localized barometric pressure, specific high-altitude clouds, and deep ocean swells. They rarely missed a storm. Willis Moore despised them. Washington viewed the Cuban methods as outdated and unscientific, trusting their own theoretical models instead. Plus, the Bureau was sick of independent Cuban forecasts reaching the U.S. and spooking southern shipping fleets. So, in the late summer of 1900, Moore issued a literal gag order. He banned the direct transmission of weather warnings from Cuba to regional U.S. weather offices. Any West Indian telegraph operator trying to warn an American port was blocked. All Caribbean data had to be routed directly to Washington, where it would be scrubbed and approved before a single warning flag could go up in a U.S. harbor. It was a calculated move to protect commerce from disruption. Moore prioritized the flow of capital over local safety. It created a fatal bottleneck. Down in Texas, Isaac Klein ran the Galveston Weather Bureau. Klein was an educated scientist and a fiercely loyal company man. He operated strictly by Washington's rules. He trusted the central office. Klein was exactly the validation the city elites needed to keep building. A decade earlier, he had written a prominent newspaper article assuring investors that a catastrophic storm surge was a physical impossibility. He claimed the exceptionally shallow continental shelf off the Texas coast would act as a natural speed bump, forcing any massive wave to break and die long before it reached the wharves. The theory was comforting. It protected property values and kept shipping insurance cheap. It was also completely wrong. But because it came from an official scientist, it erased any lingering anxiety. The bankers and railroad barons had the official word of the U.S. Weather Bureau. Their empire was immune to the open water. Deep in the Caribbean, a massive storm had formed. On September 3rd, it passed directly over Cuba, dumping heavy rains on Havana. Father Ganguait and his team watched the system closely. The barometric pressure was dropping fast. They tracked the upper-level wind currents. Based on decades of data, the Cubans knew exactly what it was doing, intensifying, entering the Gulf of Mexico, and hooking west, right toward Texas. They tried to transmit the warning. Washington ignored it. The central office scientists checked their own models and decided the storm would curve northeast, traveling up the Atlantic coast toward Florida. For days, Washington issued bulletins tracking a phantom storm up the eastern seaboard, assuring the Gulf Coast that the disturbance had safely bypassed them. The telegraph wires humming into Galveston carried nothing but standard daily data. Washington's bureaucracy had successfully muted the alarm, but by September 6th, the ocean stopped playing along. The sky remained deceptively clear, yet massive, deep-water swells started slamming into the commercial docks. The water was unnervingly heavy. It rolled in with a slow, rhythmic violence that completely defied the normal tide. These were kinetic shock waves. the displaced energy of a churning system hundreds of miles offshore, pushing a literal wall of water ahead of it. Isaac Klein noticed the swells. He walked down to the beach, saw the abnormally high tide flooding the lower sand, recorded the data, and checked his barometers. But he didn't raise the hurricane flag. Raising that flag would immediately halt the city's economic engine. Steamships would stop loading, rail yards would freeze, millions of dollars in commerce would stall. To trigger that kind of financial panic, Klein needed authorization from his superiors. He was legally bound to the central office, and the central office was sending daily telegraphs insisting the storm was hundreds of miles away in the Atlantic. He chose to wait. He chose to trust the chain of command. Over the next 48 hours, the city didn't miss a beat. Longshoremen sweat through heavy, oppressive humidity, loading the final bales of the week's cotton harvest. Streetcars rattled down the avenues. Wealthy elites dined in grand mahogany rooms, completely unaware that their own government had just blinded them to an incoming disaster. By late afternoon on September 7th, the high tide refused to recede. Heavy surf washed over the lower wharves, pooling around the iron tracks of the rail yards. The ocean was undeniably crashing over the edges of the island. Yet, without an official directive from Washington, local meteorologists sat paralyzed by procedure. 40,000 people were left entirely dependent on a deeply flawed theory of geographic immunity. As the sun set on a city still pushing its daily trade, the atmospheric pressure quietly, steadily began to plummet. When dawn broke on Saturday, September 8, 1900, the Gulf of Mexico was already occupying the streets of Galveston. It didn't arrive with a cinematic crash. It crept in. The island sat on a porous sandbar mere feet above sea level, so the ocean didn't even need to breach the shoreline to invade. The pressure of the swelling Gulf just reversed the city's drainage system. Salt water pushed up through storm grates. It bubbled through the oyster shell roads. By the time banking magnates and shipping clerks finished their morning coffee, knee-deep water was pooling in the lower wards, moving steadily toward the commercial district. Municipal logs and corporate ledgers from those early hours show exactly how the city's power brokers reacted. They didn't order an evacuation. Nobody told the working-class neighborhoods on the island's edges to move inland. They just treated the encroaching ocean like a mild logistical nuisance. The Wall Street of the South refused to stop working. Down at the wharves, dock managers told longshoremen to roll up their trousers, wade through the brackish water, and keep loading cargo. Millions of dollars in raw cotton sat in wooden warehouses, and freighters had to sail on schedule. Shutting down the port meant exorbitant fees to international shipping lines and delayed contracts. Worse, it meant a dip in the profit margins, funding those towering Victorian mansions on Broadway. By 10 o'clock that morning at 20th and the Strand, the sky was an unnatural, bruised purple. Heavy ocean swells slapped violently against the wooden pilings of the docks, yet electric streetcars stubbornly plowed through flooded intersections. Delivery wagons pulled by panicked horses splashed down the avenues, hauling luxury goods to elevated coastal estates. The city's elite had surrounded themselves with so much heavy cast iron, imported Belgian brick, and native Texas granite that they'd insulated their minds from reality. They thought the sheer mass of their architecture made them immune to nature. They built a financial empire, and empires don't just wash away. But by midday, the atmosphere broke. Inside the local weather office, the barometer started to dive. Standard sea level pressure is around 29.92 inches of mercury. By early afternoon, the needle in Galveston plunged past 29.40 and kept dropping. A massive vacuum of displaced air was moving directly over the city. That kind of pressure drop changes how the air feels. It gets oppressively heavy. The wind stops blowing and starts crushing. By 2 o'clock, the wind shifted, driving rain in horizontal sheets that shattered the glass facades of the downtown trading houses. Decades earlier, city engineers had begged for a massive seawall. They were outvoted by real estate developers worried about property taxes and blocking the ocean breezes. Now, there was absolutely nothing between the open ocean and the city grid. That municipal vote was about to be paid in full. As winds hit hurricane force, the ornate architecture of Millionaire's Row became a death trap. Sweeping verandas built to capture gentle summer breezes acted as massive sails, catching the gale and tearing heavy wooden frames straight off their brick foundations. The steep roofs that signaled Victorian opulence were covered in heavy slate tiles, imported at incredible expense to project status. Under extreme wind shear, thousands of these tiles snapped off their iron fasteners. They became high-velocity projectiles, slicing through the timber frame homes in adjacent neighborhoods. The materials bought to showcase the city's wealth were literally shredding the town. By late afternoon, the reality was obvious. This was no standard seasonal storm. The comforting, peer-reviewed theory that a shallow continental shelf would act as a natural speed bump against a tidal wave was completely wrong. Instead, it acted like a submerged ramp. The hurricane piled millions of tons of seawater higher and higher, shoving it directly onto the unprotected sandbar. The morning's commercial stubbornness gave way to panic, but it was far too late. Galveston was connected to the Texas mainland by a single narrow wooden railway trestle stretching 2 miles across the bay. There was no highway, no bridge for wagons or pedestrians. If you wanted to leave, you took the train. By 3 o'clock, the storm surge pushing into the bay had completely submerged the trestle. The last train from Houston was forced to halt on the mainland peninsula, its tracks disappearing into churning salt water. The primary telegraph cables, strung along that same exposed wooden route, snapped. The line went dead. Galveston was cut off from the rest of the world. There was no municipal evacuation protocol because a city that thinks it's invincible never plans for retreat. All 40,000 residents, from wealthy cotton brokers huddled behind shattered stained glass to immigrant dock workers scrambling onto the roofs of their flooded cottages, were locked in. The water was no longer creeping. A massive surge poured in from both the Gulf and the bay, swallowing the island from all sides. At 5:15 p.m., the anemometer on the roof of the Weather Bureau registered a sustained wind speed of 84 miles per hour. Then a massive gust caught the heavy iron instrument. The mounting brackets sheared off. The apparatus was torn from the roof and hurled into the flooded streets below. The isolated meteorologists were now flying blind. The sun set, but the sky had been black for hours. The wind emitted a continuous, deafening roar, a sound surviving engineers later compared to thousands of freight trains colliding all at once. The barometer bottomed out, and the Gulf of Mexico was about to completely overwrite the island. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the Gulf of Mexico stopped rising and simply took possession of the island. Galveston's maximum natural elevation was just under 9 feet. Later, surveys and high water marks etched into surviving masonry show the primary storm surge crested at 15.7 feet. The math was absolute. The highest, safest point in the entire city was instantly under 7 feet of moving salt water, while the dense, working-class wards on the edges of the island were buried under much more. But a storm surge isn't just a flood. It's not a static pool of water gently creeping into a living room. It's a massive kinetic event. Water is heavy. A single cubic yard of seawater weighs roughly 1,700 pounds. Push millions of tons of it forward with sustained winds over 140 miles per hour, and the hydrodynamic pressure is staggering. It acts like a slow, fluid bulldozer. To beat the oppressive Texas heat, thousands of Gilded Age homes on the island were built on raised wooden piers. They sat elevated to catch the breeze, but they weren't anchored to bedrock. As the wall of seawater rolled across the flat topography, these structures did exactly what basic physics dictates. They became buoyant. Entire neighborhoods lifted off their stilts, floating for a few brief moments in the churning darkness, before the wind shear caught their pitched roofs. The hurricane didn't just wash the city away, it weaponized the infrastructure. As the first row of coastal cottages snapped off and collapsed, the current pushed splintered timber, heavy cast iron stoves, and jagged roofing inland. This aggregate of ruin slammed into the next street of houses, shattering them and immediately adding their mass to the pile. Within an hour, this cascading failure created a staggering physical anomaly, a churning wall of wreckage stretching 3 miles across the width of the island. In some sections, it piled 2 stories high, and it moved. It crawled forward like a jagged glacier of Victorian architecture. 3,000 individual buildings were pulverized and compacted into this slow-moving barricade. Down the grand, palm-lined corridor of Broadway, the city's elites watched their economic hubris violently collapse. Earlier in the day, banking magnates and railroad tycoons had retreated to the second floors of their estates, assuming the sheer weight of their wealth would anchor them safely to the earth. They trusted imported Belgian brick, Texas granite, and heavy steel framing. But the debris wall didn't care about bank ledgers. This rolling grinder of splintered timber and cast iron slammed directly into the grand mansions. The city's electrical grid had failed hours earlier, plunging the island into suffocating darkness. The night became a symphony of structural failure, mahogany beams snapping under tension, the explosive shattering of imported European stained glass, the deafening grind of brick facades giving way to the ocean. Families huddled in their luxury parlors found themselves completely trapped in collapsing cages of their own wealth. As the eye of this unrecorded Category 4 hurricane made landfall, the atmospheric pressure bottomed out and the wind shifted direction. That pivot pushed the massive debris wall sideways, violently scraping it across the island and grinding down anything that had survived the initial northern surge. The Wall Street of the South was systematically dismantled. Thousands of citizens were caught in the dark water, where the barriers of class and wealth instantly vanished. Survival came down to geographical luck. Immigrant dock workers and elite cotton brokers fought the exact same current, their voices swallowed by the roar of the wind. By the early hours of Sunday, September 9th, the atmospheric pressure stabilized. The winds subsided to a heavy gale. As the storm system pushed inland across the Texas mainland, it lost its oceanic fuel and broke apart. The deep water receded, flowing back into the Gulf and leaving behind a drastically altered island. Sunrise revealed an entirely unrecognizable landscape. In the archival panoramic photographs taken days later, the dense grid of commercial blocks and neighborhoods is simply gone. It was total erasure, a massive, tangled scar of compacted timber, mud, and shredded cargo cut across the center of the island. The spot where the great debris wall finally ran out of momentum. South of this jagged line, stretching to the beach, the land was swept entirely clean. Not a single vertical structure remained standing. The landscape was reduced to flat, barren sand scattered with the fragmented remnants of the region's prosperity. Crushed grand pianos lay half buried in the mud. Shattered heavy iron bank safes rested hundreds of yards from where their corporate headquarters had stood. Splintered shipping crates from Liverpool and Le Havre were mixed with waterlogged velvet furniture and the torn pages of municipal ledgers. The infrastructure that defined the commercial apex of Texas just 24 hours earlier was annihilated. The grand illusion of permanence was over. The city's power brokers had gambled their futures on a flawed theory of geographic immunity. They prioritized unobstructed ocean views over protective seawall, and they placed blind faith in an administrative bureaucracy that deliberately severed their access to meteorological intelligence. They lost. But as the survivors crawled out from the wreckage, they faced a reality far more immediate than a collapsed economy. The financial center of the Texas coastline was leveled, and beneath the miles of ruined architecture lay a catastrophic human toll. With the primary railway trestle destroyed and telegraph lines severed, the island was completely isolated. The tropical heat was already beginning to rise. The streets were choked with ruined fortunes, and an unmanageable number of the dead. When the clouds finally broke on Sunday morning, the Galveston survivors woke to an alien world. The tropical heat returned, baking the wreckage. No clean water, no food. The infrastructure that had handled thousands of tons of global cargo 2 days ago was gone, replaced by miles of jagged debris. But the loss of architecture didn't matter. They were facing a public health nightmare. At least 8,000 people died in the dark, 20% of the island's population wiped out in hours. To this day, it remains the deadliest single day in American history. This wasn't an emergency the local government could manage because the local government no longer existed. The mayor and surviving council members were just as traumatized and displaced as the dock workers. Law enforcement was fractured. The commercial district, once home to heavily guarded bank vaults and luxury goods, was split open and scattered across the mud. Desperation set in immediately. With the railway trestle destroyed and telegraph lines severed, the survivors were trapped. People dug through the wreckage of the commercial wards, scavenging for canned goods, intact water cisterns, and basic medical supplies. And then came the looting. Unsecured wealth lay everywhere. The surge had literally ripped apart heavy iron bank safes. Valuables from ruined elite estates sat exposed among the splintered timber. Martial law was declared. The city formed an ad hoc Central Relief Committee and handed it absolute authority. Surviving military personnel from the coastal artillery fort, along with deputized citizens carrying salvaged rifles, patrolled the streets. Their orders were simple. Anyone caught looting would be shot on sight. But armed guards couldn't stop the real threat. The island was facing a catastrophic sanitation crisis. Thousands of bodies were trapped inside a 3-mile-long debris wall that had ground across the city. The oppressive September heat was accelerating decomposition, threatening a massive cholera outbreak. The survivors had to clear the dead immediately, using only their hands. They couldn't dig mass graves. The island had just been completely submerged, leaving the water table practically at the surface. Every trench the laborers dug immediately filled with brackish groundwater. The committee decided to bury the dead at sea. Working-age men were conscripted at gunpoint. Handed axes and ropes, they were forced into the shifting wreckage to extract the casualties. The bodies were loaded onto barges, towed into the Gulf, weighted down and dumped. It failed completely. The Gulf currents, still churning from the storm, simply rejected them. The next morning, the tide deposited the remains right back onto the shoreline. The relief committee was forced to do the only thing left. They built piers. Across the beaches and heavily destroyed residential wards, laborers stacked the splintered timber of ruined Victorian mansions and started burning the dead. For weeks, thick, acrid smoke choked the skies. The fires burned day and night. The men running the incineration teams were heavily rationed whiskey just to cope with the trauma of what they were forced to do. While Galveston burned, the outside world finally realized the island had gone silent. As mainland telegraph lines were repaired, the sheer scale of the devastation hit the trading floors of New York and London. Aid poured in. Trainloads of water, medical supplies, and canvas tents were dispatched to the edge of the Texas mainland and ferried across the bay. But capital is unsentimental. The national economy couldn't pause for grief. The Midwestern grain harvest was peaking. The southern cotton crop was already baled. Millions of tons of raw materials sat idle on rail cars across the country, waiting for a gateway to Europe. With Galveston paralyzed, the region's shipping monopoly broke overnight. Mainland power brokers saw an opportunity. The disaster had brutally exposed the flaw of building a maritime hub on an exposed sandbar. Shipping conglomerates and insurance companies were suddenly terrified of the Texas coast. They needed a secure port, insulated from the Gulf. 50 miles inland, a muddy bayou town recognized its moment. Houston had always lived in the shadow of Galveston's wealth. It was just a secondary transit hub where mainland rail lines converged before sending cargo to the island. But Houston had one massive advantage. It sat far inland, safely elevated from the surge, connected to the bay only by the shallow waters of Buffalo Bayou. Before the smoke even cleared over Galveston, Houston's politicians launched an aggressive lobbying campaign in Washington, D.C. Their argument was simple. Galveston was a liability. Rebuilding on that sandbar was a foolish gamble. Instead, they proposed a massive federal project to dredge Buffalo Bayou, widening it into a secure inland ship channel. The lobbying worked. Federal funding came through, and heavy dredging equipment began tearing through the bayou banks, carving out a deep-water route that let international steamships bypass the ruined island and dock directly in Houston. The financial migration was ruthless. The surviving banking conglomerates, insurance firms, and cotton brokers didn't wait for Galveston to recover. They packed up their ledgers and relocated 50 miles north. The flow of global wealth that had defined the island for decades was cleanly rerouted. Galveston was left with a ruined port and a fractured population. Mainland opportunists were stripping the town of its commercial supremacy. Yet a stubborn faction of the city's surviving elite refused to abandon the sandbar. As they watched the capital drain toward Houston, they realized reclaiming their crown meant doing something desperate. To convince the maritime industry the island was safe, they couldn't rely on flawed theories anymore. They had to physically alter their geography. They had to build the seawall they had rejected for decades, and they had to lift the entire ruined metropolis directly into the sky. But how does a bankrupt, shattered city elevate thousands of buildings and millions of tons of earth while the Gulf of Mexico is still battering its shores? Altering the geography of an entire city while standing in the ruins of its total collapse takes pure mechanical brute force. The surviving power brokers of Galveston had watched the region's shipping monopolies and financial ledgers migrate 50 miles north to the muddy banks of Houston. They understood exactly what this capital flight meant. Investors demand security. They demand predictable logistics. To convince the global maritime industry that the Texas coast was still open for business, Galveston's elite had to permanently eliminate the environmental vulnerability of their sandbar. They needed a fortress. The municipal bond records from 1902 show a brutal financial irony. The exact same coastal defense project that local politicians and real estate developers systematically killed in the 1880s to avoid raising property taxes was now a non-negotiable mandate. But this time, the city was bankrupt. The commercial infrastructure was shattered. The tax base was gone. The county had to issue massive bonds just to begin clearing the coastal wreckage. Through a desperate lobbying effort, they convinced the state legislature to let them keep local taxes for 15 years, funneling every available dollar into an unprecedented civil engineering bet. They began with the barricade, In the late summer of 1902, contractors started building the Galveston seawall. It was designed as a solid curtain of reinforced concrete stretching across the entire Gulf-facing perimeter of the island. The engineering parameters were exact. A wall standing 17 feet above the low tide mark, 16 feet wide at its base, tapering up to a 5-foot crest. But a flat vertical surface can't withstand the brunt of the open ocean. Water is simply too heavy. A direct impact would eventually shatter the concrete. Structural engineers solved this by designing the seawall with a concave face. The curve was mathematically calculated to catch the forward momentum of a storm swell and throw the wave energy vertically back onto itself. To anchor this structure into the unstable sandbar, laborers drove heavy timber pilings 40 feet deep into the ground. They layered the foundation with crushed stone and cement, pouring the concrete in huge continuous blocks to ensure there were no structural joints the ocean could exploit. Out front, they dropped 27,000 tons of raw Texas granite riprap as an initial speed bump against the surf. It was an engineering marvel, but it created a severe secondary problem. The seawall was 17 feet high. The surviving commercial district and residential wards directly behind it still sat at an elevation of barely 5 feet. If a hurricane surge topped the new barricade, the water would be trapped inside, turning the city into an inescapable concrete bowl. Building the wall wasn't enough. They had to physically lift the entire city. They called it the grade raising. The logistics were a nightmare. Galveston was an active, recovering city with thousands of surviving buildings, miles of streetcar tracks, underground plumbing, and heavy masonry. The government mandated that the ground level of the entire city be elevated to match the height of the new seawall, sloping gently toward the bay. In some neighborhoods, that meant raising the earth by 11 feet. Wheelbarrows and shovels weren't going to cut it. The city contracted with European engineering firms who deployed a fleet of self-propelled hopper dredges. These vessels sailed into the ship channel and began sucking up millions of tons of dense, wet sand from the ocean floor. To get this material into the city, the engineers made a ruthless tactical decision. They dug a temporary 2-mile-long canal straight through the residential grid. Homeowners in the path were forced to relocate while dredges navigated directly into the center of the island. The dredges connected to a network of heavy iron discharge pipes snaking through the streets. They pumped a thick, aggressive slurry, water and compacted sea sand, directly into the neighborhoods. For the residents, the grade raising was a grueling ordeal. Before the slurry could be pumped into a block, every single structure on that block had to be elevated. The burden fell entirely on property owners. Using manual, hand-turned screwjacks, laborers crawled beneath the timber frames of coastal cottages and the stone foundations of Victorian mansions. They turned the jacks inch by inch, lifting the structures into the air. They stacked heavy wooden cribbing underneath to hold them in place. By 1904, the island looked surreal. Over 2,000 homes, churches, and commercial buildings were suspended on wooden blocks, 10 feet in the air. Once a block was elevated, the discharge pipes opened. The heavy slurry flooded the yards, pooling under the suspended houses. The water slowly drained away into the canal, leaving behind a thick, hardened layer of new earth. Over several years, the city buried its original topography. Daily life ground to a halt. The ground was a shifting sea of wet mud and pumping stations. Walking on the earth was impossible. The city built an elaborate network of elevated wooden catwalks, connecting the raised doorways to the commercial district. Citizens navigated their lives on these narrow planks, walking above the roaring discharge pipes and the slow accumulation of dredged sand. If an owner couldn't afford the private contractors to jack up their home, they got no reprieve. The municipal mandate was absolute. The slurry pumped regardless. Dozens of structures simply had their ground floors buried, forcing the occupants to abandon their lower parlors and convert second-story windows into front doors. By 1910, the job was largely complete. The island had imported over 16 million cubic yards of sand. The surviving footprint of the Gilded Age was permanently sealed beneath a fresh, engineered topography. In the late summer of 1915, the defense system was tested. A hurricane of nearly identical intensity to the 1900 storm struck the Texas coast. Heavy swells battered the island. Extreme wind tore at the newly elevated roofs. But the concave seawall performed exactly as designed. The wall of salt water fractured and was thrown back into the Gulf. The elevated grade prevented catastrophic flooding. The physical city survived. The engineering was a triumph. The economic reality was a disaster. Fortifying the sandbar required an enormous amount of capital, time, and human labor, taking a full decade to deploy. In that time, the national economy moved on. While Galveston was pumping mud under catwalks, Houston finished dredging Buffalo Bayou. The Houston Ship Channel officially opened to deep water traffic in 1914, providing a secure, entirely inland route for international freighters. Galveston's regional monopoly was broken. International shipping conglomerates and railroad barons looked at the newly fortified island and shrugged. Why navigate the volatile open Gulf and pay premium maritime insurance rates when a protected inland port operated just 50 miles away? Corporate headquarters didn't return to Broadway's grand estates. The flow of global exports bypassed the island entirely. The Wall Street of the South had saved its physical existence, but engineered its own economic demotion. Today, the Strand in Galveston is lined with pristine, restored Victorian facades. They are undeniably beautiful, but they are hollow. They operate as souvenir shops, boutique hotels, and quaint cafes catering to weekend tourists. The heavy hum of unchecked commercial dominance is gone. 50 miles north on the mainland, Houston displays a sprawling, relentless industrial footprint. Miles of oil refineries, corporate skyscrapers, and global logistics hubs dominate the regional economy. Houston capitalized on a catastrophe and never relinquished the crown. Galveston remains a haunting artifact. It engineered its way out of environmental erasure, only to find itself economically stranded. It operates in the quiet shadow of the empire it once controlled. The heavy concrete seawall still stands along the coast, but beneath the imported sand and the picturesque tourist districts lies the foundation of America's worst natural disaster. Galveston rebuilt its island and saved itself from the ocean, but it could never engineer its way back to the top.